Hey guys, it's been a little while, but I've been out in the visual effects industry trying to learn the tools of the trade. I've been pretty fortunate. I've been able to work on some really cool movies, particularly the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I worked on a few movies in those. And after all that, I feel like I can impart some useful production techniques for any aspiring filmmakers out there, particularly for visual effects shots. Today I want to show you an accumulation of the knowledge that I've gained by going over an entire visual effects shot from complete start to complete finish. Here's what I made. It's a cool shadow cat that was inspired by the fantasy novel Nevernight by Jay Kristoff. So thanks Jay for writing a cool novel. And yeah, there's just this cool kind of shadow cat in the book. So this video will be a guide to point you in the right direction of each stage of the visual effects process. The programs that I use to produce this shot are Maya, Nuke, Blender, and Premiere Pro. I'll have the links down below to all the tutorials that I use to make each stage of this shot happen. However, if you feel there's not enough information in the links or the tutorial doesn't cover exactly what you need for your shot, it's just a simple matter of Googling what you need. That's all I did for this and it'll work for you as well. Like I said, this is all about the structure of a visual effects shot. Where to start, where to finish. All right, let's do it. So first of all, we shoot our footage. I just went into my garage. I figured it as good a place as any. In my case, I used a Sony Alpha 7 on a 35mm lens. The great thing about the Sony Alpha 7 is that it's a full frame SLR, meaning that there's no cropping ratio when it comes to using lenses. So pretty much what you see is what you get. Now at first I tried shooting completely handheld, but I found the motion to be a little bit too jerky at times, giving too much motion blur. I knew this was going to cause problems later on in 3D tracking. So what I did was I got out my gimbal and I used that instead. It still gives kind of a handheld look, but it made things a lot easier for me just to track my camera in post. While shooting, I just had to imagine where the cat would be and kind of frame accordingly. Note the red tracking marks, which are just red gaffer tape. I put these down to give me some extra tracking data for where the floor would be. There's a lot of points of contrast on the walls, but not that many on the ground, besides some smudges from tire tracks, which wouldn't work as well as a hard point of contrast. Okay, so once you're done shooting, grab your homemade checkerboard. Hold on, I've got mine here. Grab your checkerboard and just point your camera at it until it takes up the whole screen space of your camera. We'll use this later to underdistort the lens. Now, a quick note, I didn't end up using my undistorted lens that much in my comp, but it's always good to have more than you need. All right, now you want to take some quick measurements of the set. This should be the distance between any hard points of contrast that you know are going to track well. In my case, I just used the length, width, and height of the box that the cat would jump on. And just remember, this distance needs to be measured in centimeters. Lastly, you need a chrome ball. My chrome ball it's literally a ball bearing that used to be in an airplane wheel. I just bought it off an old friend at uni. But it works just as well, you know, you got your reflection there. I got a spoon, I attached the spoon to the top of my tripod, and then I sat this on the spoon, and that worked just as well. You're going to set that chrome ball in the middle of the set, and you're going to take about 5 to 7 different exposure level photographs of the chrome ball from where you're standing from each side of the set. So one from the front and one from the back. I'm going to use this later to stitch together a HDRi image. I'm going to use that to light our 3D scene. I found a really thorough tutorial of this method by Drexel Ace Lab. I've linked that down below. They did a great summary of the method needed. All right, great. Now that we've got our footage, it's time to set up our file structure. This structure is an accumulation of what I've seen other people do and what I find works best for me, but the trick is to always know where you would go to find what you need. So in my program files, I have all the save files of all the programs that I'll be using. Only the Maya file has actual assets and textures saved inside it as well, since that's just how Maya operates. You know, I've got my assets here, I've got my images, you know, textures, things like that. Don't mind these programs down here. I didn't end up actually using them. Reference has any reference that you'll need to produce your shot, be that for animation or simulation checks or whatever else you'll need. Footage is where you'll put your footage. You know, here's where I put my Sony, when I shot on my Sony Alpha 7, I put my first round here, and then I did a second round, which I chose for my finals. And then I made sure that I labeled my final one as final pick with the 35mm lens, so I wouldn't forget what lens I shot on. Sound and music is where you can store said files for the finished edit, if you want to add some sound and music there. So export should be kind of a mirror for your program files folder. I'll show you what I mean. I'll pull up the program files folder here. And you can just see like, from After Effects, and then I have After Effects here, then I have from Blender, and I have my Blender stuff here. From Photoshop, I'll have Photoshop here. They're not numbered correctly, but you can see what I mean. Pretty much this is the program, and this is where they are exporting whatever footage you're making from them to. So for example, I'll put my smoke simulation passes, which came from Blender here. So go to from Blender, and then I have all my smoke simulation passes there. Cool, onto camera track. Having a good camera track can help you out immensely when it comes to post-production effects. There are a few programs out there that specialize in this area, but Nuke can do a great job as well. I used a very in-depth tutorial from Matthew R that I've linked down below to both understop my lens and get a great track. Matthew lays things out in a very comprehensive way and goes at a nice, easy pace. So have a look at his tutorial for this stage. I felt that I only needed the first 4 videos of his 9-part series covering this method, but those first 4 were integral. Now, one trick that you're going to run into is scale. 3D camera that you just generated in Nuke is not going to be the right scale. It will have the right movements, but it won't be the right scale. Most likely all that camera movement will take place in the real world equivalent of about 1 cubic centimeter. This may not be a problem if you just want to make all your 3D models like super tiny, but I like to keep all my 3D work in real world scale. It just makes everything easier. Like, how big should I model my cat to make sure it fits in that garage, like in a normal cat size? It'll also affect things like simulations. For example, a 1 centimeter piece of cloth is going to simulate falling very differently to a 1 meter square piece of cloth. It takes into account weight and stuff like that. So to address this problem, there's this nifty little technique in Nuke where you can select 2 points of contrast in the camera track and actually tell them the distance between one another. This is where my measurement of the box came in handy. I didn't find any video tutorials of this online, but I've provided a link to a super easy to follow page of Nuke's manual below that goes over the process. Just remember, Nuke's default unit of measurement is in centimeters, so the number that you enter for the distance between points of contrast will need to be in centimeters. Once you enter those numbers, the scene will automatically be scaled to the 3D real-world equivalent. Once I had my camera track data, I used a tutorial by Jay Fernsler to generate a mesh of the scene, which I could bring into Maya and use as a point of reference. This method was particularly useful because it gave me the location of the box that the cat jumps onto. I was able to bring this rough mesh into Maya and clean it up nicely, and I then used that nice clean version for my animation block out later. All right, let's move on to Roto Paint. Roto Paint is the process where you prepare a shot for the rest of the pipeline. The shot, aka the plate, is taken by a rotoscope and or digital paint artist and cleaned up. Now, the artist may need to trace parts of the shot, which is the rotoscope part of things, in order to place objects behind something in the footage, or remove some boom mics from the top of the shot by digitally painting them out. Either way, it's a Roto Paint artist's job to provide a clean plate. So to sum it up, it's kind of like Photoshop for moving images. In this example, that means removing the tracking markers. The method that I used to remove these tracking markers was a technique that was taught to me by my friend and mentor, Michael North. He is a genius when it comes to this stuff, and he even made an entire tutorial series and all of his techniques that I've linked down below. Give it a watch, guys. You'll learn some industry standard methods that are integral to any filmmaker who doesn't want to stress while they're on set. If you accidentally caught the sound guy in the corner of your shot, it's no big deal. Because with these methods, you can easily remove anything that wasn't supposed to be on screen. So first of all, I'll denoise the plate so that I'm not painting over any digital grain. You can see the grain a little bit more in the dark areas here. You can either purchase the Neat Video plugin, which does an amazing job, or you can just use the built-in Denoise Nuke node, which still works okay, but can sometimes remove some crisp detailing along with the noise. Cool, so when you've got that all figured out, render out a version of this denoised footage and bring it back into Nuke to work on. I'm using the 3D camera track to project my clean patches right on top of the red markers. This meant I only needed to paint 2 patches for each marker to cover it up. One was at frame 0 and another one was at frame 220. And all I'm doing is a nice slow dissolve between those 2 patches over the course of 70 frames to manage any changes in perspective and lighting. Due to parallax and perspective change, doing all of this without a 3D camera would have been extremely difficult. At the very least, all those small transformations and warps would have been super time consuming. In fact, I'll give you an example of a shot that I did for Captain Marvel. Look at this parallax and perspective change. The raw footage of this shot had a bunch of safety regulations in place, like do not cross tapes flapping in the wind and safety cones all over the place to point out hazards on the rooftop. Not to mention the equipment and crew blocking off all the streets in the background here for the shoot. I remember there was a massive orange safety cone right here in the foreground. I spent a good 3 days trying to remove all of this stuff with 2D methods before I just bit the bullet and created my own 3D camera for the shot. And that turned out to be a lifesaver. Small tangent here, I know, but I just want to get across the point of making your own 3D camera. I know it can be hard, especially if you have no experience in camera tracking. It is worth learning because it can save you hours, if not days of frustrating work, and you'll get things done easier and quicker. Removing these markers took me less than an hour. You should also use this time to create your HDRi sphere that you'll use for lighting your 3D scene later. This was the tutorial that was done by Drexel Ace Lab that I talked about earlier. I decided to paint myself out of one of the sides of the reflection, but it's not a must. You'll still get a fairly good result with the picture as is. Okay, modeling, rigging, and textures. Now, there are a dime a dozen tutorials out there on making 3D models in Maya. I'm not going to provide any links because chances are you can easily find a tutorial to help you out on what you want to make specifically. As for my cat, I downloaded a free base mesh off of TurboSquid, and I just made some adjustments to make it a little bit more to my liking, just to save some time. Cool, so once I had my model finished, I saved it to its own scene and started a new scene for the rig. I used a plugin called Advanced Skeleton to rig the cat and get it to deform properly. I have a link to the big general overview on the plugin for rigging bipeds, which are humans, or anything that walks on 2 legs really. That's by Joshua Jones, and I've also provided another link to a fast-paced tutorial on rigging quadrupeds, so those are living things that have 4 legs, like a cat, which was published by Advanced Skeleton itself. That second tutorial is definitely for people who are already familiar with the tool and rigging in general, so set some time aside to learn the plugin first if you're new to rigging. Once the cat was deforming nicely, I saved it to its own scene and imported the cat's model into a new scene to make the render model. So by this stage, your one model should have 3 separate saved scenes. Model, rigged, rendered. Model is for building it, rigging is for rigging it, render is for applying the textures. When it comes to textures, I did have a basic color texture on my cat, but that was just to have a little something underneath the fur. I used a tutorial by Mike Hermes to generate and groom the fur in Maya, and I've linked that down below. I also used a tutorial on setting up fur to use in the render engine Redshift by Small Robot Studio. That's also linked below. So yes, I used Redshift to render my cat, but honestly, whether you use Arnold or Mental Ray or whatever, they all follow the same basic principles. Alrighty, animation. When it came to animation, I had an animation scene that I used to get things looking right. And once I was happy with everything, I cached out the animation and applied that cache to the render model of the cat that was set up in the render scene. Now, animation is the same as modeling, guys. There are so many tutorials out there on how to do things your way and for what you'll need. So I just won't provide any links to that, but just a quick Google will help you out with whatever you need to animate. Just remember to always look at reference footage. I looked at a lot of cats. Cats move weird. It's weird. All right, so that brings us to rendering. This is where we use our custom high dynamic range imagery sphere, or our HDRi, to perfectly replicate the lighting on set. You can use the render engine's lights to kind of replicate what things should look like, sure, yeah. But with this HDRi, everything is already taken care of. All right, so we have our render cat scene file imported with the animation applied to the mesh. So that's all moving nicely. Here is where you set up your render layers, like your shadow catches and beauty passes to use in compositing later. Once again, I use the render engine Redshift to set my scene up. Below is a link to how to set up render scenes in Redshift by Create 3D Characters. Thanks, guys. Also, one really useful tip that I used from the tutorial by Jesus Fernandez was setting up matte IDs. Basically, this was a pass setup that let me apply different color values to different parts of my cat mesh that would come in handy later. So for example, I could assign a green color to the eyes, but a red color to the body. And then I ended up using the green mattes of the eyes to cut through the smoke simulation later, so the cat's eyes were never obscured by smoke. Moving on to effects and simulations. Simulations were the hardest part of this process for me. Out of all the stages of production, generating effects is the area that I have the least amount of experience in. I kind of pulled my hair out for a few days trying to just figure out which program I should use to get this smoky, wispy effect. And at first I tried Maya, but the smoke effects proved to be a bit pedantic. I could only get pretty poor results. So then I thought I'd jump on board the Houdini train. Houdini is the industry standard when it comes to simulations. So I thought, now would be a good time to learn. But after installing it and going over some tutorials online, I felt like I was in a foreign country trying to learn the native language. Most of the tutorials on what I needed, which was pyro effects, they were super outdated, to the point where buttons on the user interface of the tutorial weren't even located in the same area of the version that I was using. I know Houdini is the program to use for this stuff, but I just didn't have the time or the energy to learn everything needed. So I finally downloaded Blender. Now, I've been meaning to download Blender for years now, but I've always had Maya to do what I needed to be done in 3D. Blender proved very beginner-friendly when it comes to smoke simulations, at least. I found a bunch of helpful tutorials explaining the process in detail, and it was fairly simple to go back and make changes as I tried out new methods for the simulation, which was pretty cool. I've linked the 3 most useful tutorials I found for smoke sims in Blender 2.79 below. A massive thank you to Lotzolot, Blender Made Easy, and Surface Studio for your amazing tutorials. Thanks, guys. However, the one thing that Blender proved to be an absolute pain in was setting up the scene. One thing that is pretty standard for every other 3D program out there proved to be a real nightmare for Blender. So I just want to let you guys know about that now, and that was in importing a camera from Maya. No matter how much I tried, I couldn't import my camera track from Maya into Blender. It just didn't work. Now, okay, I could be missing something, but surely something so simple should have a tutorial out there, right? I couldn't find any. I was able to get transformations applied correctly to the Blender camera, but the rotations were all off, and the camera backing was a bit out as well, I think. But then I tried importing Nuke's camera track directly into Blender, and voila, it worked. Well, it was about 95% correct. Some of the lens distortions seemed to be slightly off, but I was able to take care of that in compositing. So thank you Lexia, who made the tutorial that helped me learn the method of importing Nuke camera data into Blender. That's also linked down below. Now, quick word of warning, you'll need to learn a bit of Python scripting to get this to work. I actually found that the wall of script that you need to copy paste into Blender's text editor doesn't actually work as is, but after some digging, I found that all you need to do is just delete some spacing before some specific lines. Basically, you just keep pressing run script, and wherever it tells you that the line has an error, just delete that space before it. By the time you get to the bottom, it'll work. Compositing! Finally. All right, compositing. This is the end of the pipeline. The compositor takes all the elements, sticks them together, and makes sure that everything belongs in that shot. My composition is a fairly basic one, but let's go through it step by step to see what's happening. So at the top, we have all of our plate elements, like our camera track, distortion, grained and degrained plate, all good, cool. And first thing below that is the paint process, where I'm removing the tracking markers. Pre-comp your paint, and that is now your new plate. All right, remember, this is all done with the degrained plate. There is no grain here, no sorry. Some studios like to add the grain on top of their painted patches, and the Roto Paint artist will then render out their paint work to the compositor as a clean grained plate. And then it's up to the compositor to redo the grain how they see fit. But since it's only me here and I know the history of the plate, I'm gonna just keep working on the degrained plate. So first, I'm just adding my shadow pass to the cat. I actually used a holdout of the cat where I rendered this, but it's not a big deal since the cat's body covers those holdout areas pretty perfectly. You'll notice the grid warp here. This was just used to put a slight adjustment on the cat's back leg shadows where the cat jumps on top of the box. The shadows didn't line up 100% with the footage plate, but the grid warp nudges it into place nicely, so it's just smack bang on the edge there. Then comes the beauty pass. Cool, I just needed this to check the animation and make sure the cat was moving okay. Then fur, all right, looking good. And then we've got our shadow smoke from frame 145 to 233. All this is, when we put on the smoke later, there's a little bit more volume happening here that I feel like should be obscuring the light a bit more. So all I did was I just came to the area, look down here, and this darker patch, that is all being driven by a really simple roto shape. And that's just animated along the ground there. So if we were to look here, that's the shape that it's making. And by the time we look at the smoke here, that I just felt that worked a little bit better. Okay. So we have the shadow of our smoke, cool. And then we have some lingering smoke. So what that is if we look at the actual smoke pass, so if I jump into the smoke pass here, and then we just look at the alpha, it's a bit easier to see there. By the time the cat jumps away, the smoke from where it jumped from, it kind of disperses pretty quickly. So what I did was I just grabbed the end of the smoke here. So this end part here, and I just frame offsetted it so that it would come by, an extra, it would come 7 frames later. And then what I did was I just used that to kind of have the smoke linger around for a little bit longer after the cat jumped. It's a small, subtle effect, but I felt it added a little bit extra. And you can only really see that after we've added the smoke on top. So cat jumps, and then there's just a little bit of lingering smoke here at the end, which I felt added just that little bit extra. Cool. Got our lingering smoke. That kind of happens from frame 216 onwards. Got our smoke pass. I did a lot of work to this. Pretty much what I was talking about earlier, where the blender camera, the frame backing was a little bit off. Like it was like the lens distortion was slightly off. So if I was to look at the smoke pass without all these things that I did to it here, hold on, 2, 3, 4. If I was to disable them, you can see like there's some motion blur missing. It's slightly off in a lot of places down here. So on, off, especially around the feet I found. If we jump back here, I'm sure we can find, yeah, there you can see right there. It was just slightly off on the feet. So corrections on, corrections off. But yeah, I wasn't too worried about it because I knew I could fix it up in compositing later. And then we have our motion blur. So I put this into effect when the cat jumped. So you can see it around here. This was the pass when it came out of Blender. It's a bit odd. I'm not sure. I'm not 100% sure how Blender handles stuff, but I'm not that familiar with it anyway. So I'm sure there was a way to put in good motion blur during Blender, but I also wasn't too worried because once again, I could put that in during compositing. So pretty much what happened was I got the pass, and then I used a little neat trick here, which I put a convolve node in here. And then I used a little spline tool here to just tell the warp where to go. So you can see, so this is without the motion blur, and this is with. And it's a cool little trick here because you see this guy, he just moves and he kind of controls the motion blur. So if we watch it here, you can actually see how it's controlling the motion blur. See? And then less. Cool, so all that motion blur was looking pretty cool. And then what I did next was I just added some extra eye glow to the cat. I just thought it looked kind of cool. You can see it a bit better over here. So this is the cat before eye glow, and this is the cat after eye glow. It's like, it's just got that kind of that eerie feeling about it that I really liked. So in order to do that, that was just quickly, I used those matte IDs that I was talking about earlier. There's the red of the cat, there's the green of the eyes. And what I pretty much did was I told the program, I just want the green of the eyes and I only want that to be in the alpha. So that's the alpha of the eyes there. Then I played around with that alpha until I got them into a kind of like diamond-y falling off kind of alpha here. And then I pre-composited that with the beauty pass of the cat. So I got these nice sharp eyes. So this is what it was first. And then I just put those nice sharp eyes over the top of that. And then, just chuck that on top and you got this really cool kind of effect for the eyes here. And then after that, it was just a matter of using dust grain. Now, guys, this node, it is insane amazing for regraining your plate. There's a tutorial on how to use it on Vimeo, which I'll add below. That is by Fabian Holtz. Fabian, thank you so much for this node. It is free. You just download it off Nukepedia. It's a free gizmo, and mate, thank you so much. So pretty much once all that's taken care of, yep, you just pretty much, you get all the changes that you made to the plate. For me, it was pretty much this. You can see that's the cat there, and you can see all the smoke the cat was affecting with the background there. And then those are my 4 patches, of course. And then I feed them into dust grain. They get all grained. They pretty much, dust grain just takes a look at the Sony Alpha 7 grain, and then it reapplies it just on top of the cat here. So it's kind of subtle. You might not be able to see it on YouTube, but that's with grain, and that's without. Oh, geez, it is so subtle. Maybe you can kind of see it there. Without grain, with grain. Cool. And that just helps it sit in that grain plate a bit better. Personally, I hate grain. I don't know why we show movies with grain. It's so easy to get rid of it. But you know, it's the standard way of doing things. So we apply that grain and then we write out our render. And then our render is written out as an image sequence, which we bring into Premiere Pro. And so from Premiere, guys, we just bring it in. We import an image sequence, make sure it's playing back at 24 frames a second. I shot on the Alpha 7 in 24 frames a second, and we just want to make sure that Premiere is interpreting that footage as 24 frames per second. And then we render out. This is the stage where you can kind of put in some sound effects if you want. I didn't bother with that. This was all just a purely visual exercise for me, but that's how you do it. Alrighty, so that brings us to the end of things. I hope you got something out of watching all of this. There's a lot of things to take into account, I know, when you want to make a visual effects shot, and there's a reason why a lot of people specialize in each stage of it, but it's completely possible to learn every stage and make a really cool shot yourself. It can be intimidating, but it's possible, guys. I like to think of each stage and how I'm going to handle it, how we're going to shoot it. And for me, I'm not so much of, I don't consider myself a visual effects artist as I do consider myself a filmmaker. And I learned all of these processes just to help me become a better filmmaker. Like I said, you know, when I was shooting this shot, when I was shooting the plate for this visual effects shot, I knew what I wanted when I was shooting. I knew to make sure that there wasn't too much motion blur. I could just plan for what was coming in down the track. And I feel like if more filmmakers, more directors knew how to kind of shoot for what they were going to need in post, it would save time and money. You know, there's two huge factors right there for getting any sort of project done. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. If you make some cool stuff, show me. If you have some questions, ask me. I love talking about this stuff. I love sharing my knowledge with people. I love learning from other people. You know, all of us are beginners. All of us have room to learn. And that's what I love about the film industry. It's a hugely collaborative process. And I just love working with all you creatives out there. So I hope this helps you plan your shot in some way if you're doing a visual effects shot. If you're just watching because you're kind of curious, I hope you got something out of it as well. There's a lot of stages here, but they're all super fascinating and interesting. Anyway, that's all from me, guys. Have a good one. I'll catch you in the next video.